Nothing has a potential of changing people's lives more than aviation. It changed entire cultures because suddenly the boundaries that we had were no longer the boundaries.
Aviation comes with some risk, and if you are going to be a part of the aviation industry, you must understand that risk and you must mitigate that risk as much as possible. Otherwise, your industry is not going to grow.
Safety has to begin with an industry that is dedicated to safety. And the FAA's job is to oversight their compliance with safety.
If you can find the system, find the threads, and then foster collaboration on safety in particular, I think that's where the breakthroughs are going to come.
We're committed to it, and when FAA and the industry are committed to things, we have accomplished tremendous results.
The Federal Aviation Administration has been faced with challenges and goals since Congress created it back in 1958. The Act, which was passed by Congress and signed into law in the wake of a tragic mid-air collision over the Grand Canyon, replaced the old Civil Aeronautics Administration with a modern agency. The Federal Aviation Act that was signed into law that year required all U.S. airlines and U.S. airplane operators to maintain the highest practical level of safety in the public interest. The new FAA was directed to establish and maintain a comprehensive set of up-to-date aviation regulations. It was also given sole responsibility for the nation's system of air navigation and air traffic control. But one of the agency's biggest roles has been that of promoting and enforcing aviation safety. It's there that the FAA has truly made its mark. Aviation accident rates have declined year after year. As a matter of fact, in 1998, not one single U.S. airline had a serious accident, nor was anyone killed while traveling aboard a scheduled U.S. air carrier. That remarkable statistic remains the exception, however. And although air travel is far and away the safest form of transportation on Earth, airline accidents still occur. When they do, they grab headlines everywhere. An amateur video camcorder taped this horrifying image of an airline crash in Sioux City, Iowa in 1989. A DC-10 jumbo jet with 296 people on board was severely disabled when one of its engines malfunctioned and exploded. In a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, all the jet's flight controls were disabled, even backup systems, leaving the pilots with nothing except thrust, the power of the jet engines. Because the flight crew was highly skilled, they managed to get Flight 232 to an airport where emergency equipment was standing by. But in the daring attempt to land it, the big jet caught fire and tumbled. Miraculously, 184 of those on board were saved. Today, Flight 232's captain, Al Hames, has retired from airline flying, but maintains a grueling schedule as a public speaker. He travels to over 100 cities every year to address safety forums.
I think there were 5 factors that led to the degree of success we had that day in Sioux City. Those 5 are luck.
Hames attributes the degree of survival on Flight 232 to both improvements in flight crew training and better emergency preparedness on the ground.
The training that we had on United, they have gone to what they call a command leadership resource or cockpit resource management, depending on how you want to call it, where it's a team effort. So the crew all works together as a team. Use whatever things you have available. The people on the ground have all been trained the same way. So all these trainings were reinforced that this is the way that we should be trained. So all the airlines now use a crew resource, CRM or CLR procedure now, which they didn't do before. Because you have, the captain is no longer, he's the office manager. He's got the final say. But let's use the experience you have in the other 2 seats. Prior to this, in the 50s, the other 2 seats didn't matter. It was the captain who made all the decisions.
In its quest to keep today's U.S. air transportation industry the safest in the world, the FAA relies on the Flight Standards Service, its frontline force, to interact with air crews, ground crews, and operators.
Hello there. You guys flying 1641?
We are. Captain Hawk.
Jim Gardner, nice to meet you. How you doing?
Scott Taylor.
Hey, Scott, how are you? Show you my 110A. I was hoping to do a cockpit inspection.
Flight Standards consists of a cadre of more than 3,000 dedicated professionals. including inspectors like Jim Gardner. They stage out of more than 100 district offices across the country and overseas, and deal directly with airway users. Today, Gardner will accompany an air crew on a flight from Washington to Denver to measure its level of professionalism.
Last 15 minutes.
Meanwhile, Inspector Bill Moss evaluates a private pilot for his knowledge of FAA regulations, as well as his flying skills. Moss, who was once a combat helicopter pilot in Vietnam, is now dedicated to making the skies as safe as possible for those who choose to venture there.
How you doing, sir? Bill Bergman with the FAA.
Flight Standards Inspector Bill Bergman, who's also a flight engineer in the Air Force Reserve, concentrates on the complex issues of aviation maintenance. Bergman inspects aircraft of all shapes and sizes, from big jets to helicopters, to help make sure they are safe to operate. Inspector Mona Tyndall, whose specialty is aircraft radios and avionics, may also be called upon to spot check aircraft operators, like Ron Gatewood. Tyndall's job on this particular day is to make sure that Gatewood's airworthiness inspections, licenses, and certificates are all up to date. All inspectors share in this responsibility. Like most operators, Gatewood passed this check with flying colors. The Flight Standards Service also provides an ongoing series of aviation safety programs throughout the U.S., including regular seminars to help encourage safety and proficiency.
The instrument conditions is the leading cause of general aviation accidents.
The FAA knows that those who regularly attend these seminars have better than average safety records and awards those who achieve safety-related goals. Flight standards inspectors even regulate and monitor air shows to keep them safe for the general public. Air shows are one of the most popular outdoor events in America. They help inspire young people to seek out careers in aviation. And although exhibition flying is risky by nature, the FAA wants to be certain this form of entertainment remains as safe as possible. The work of the men and women of the Flight Standards Service is both challenging and diverse. Flight standards inspectors are typically seasoned professionals with years of experience in aviation. After all, this frontline team must interact day in and day out with those in the aviation industry. They also represent the nearly 50,000 employees who make up the FAA. In the very early days of airline operations, on-time arrivals like this one were few and far between.
From New York and the East, arriving 4:20 on time.
There was very little regulation and no flight standard service. When this tri-motor Ford was the airliner of choice, flying was barely 30 years old, and passengers brave enough to go by plane were happy to arrive on the day they were supposed to, let alone the hour. In the years after World War II, when both the airlines and private flying were really coming into their own, the skies overhead were still not as regulated nor as safe as they are today. Al Haynes joined United Airlines in the 1950s. He says that back then it was impossible for air traffic controllers to keep an eye on everything.
Back in the 50s, first of all, not all the areas had air traffic control radar. So sometimes some pilots would kind of cheat a little bit. To save time, they may go from point A to point C and just kind of report passing by point B and say they were there. It didn't happen very often. It only happened when the weather was good. You never really went plowing through the sky without knowing where you're going. As it began to progress and we got bigger and faster and all this, the crew began to become more involved until today we have cockpit resource management, or as United calls it, command leadership resource training, so that the crew works together.
Haynes says the advanced weather radar now available has made another big difference.
Weather was always a problem when you were flying aircraft with no weather radar because you had no idea what you're going into. So you would usually go around it. So delays were very common in the summer because of skirting thunderstorms and so forth. Now, with your radar and their radar, you can pick a hole and go through it and usually not have any problems. So that's another big change that's taken place, much for the better.
Al Haynes knows, better than most, just how critical a good aircrew can be. Every pilot knows that you can't fly an airplane without controls. Haynes and his team pulled off a miracle.
Oh, boy.
In recognition, he has received dozens of awards and
We'll find a
honors.
slot. I guarantee we will. Thank you. That's very nice.
Associate FAA Administrator Tom McSweeney has watched the Flight Standards Service mature. McSweeney began his career in aviation as a structural dynamics engineer, then came to work for the agency in the mid-1970s. Like Al Haynes, Tom McSweeney has seen a lot of change.
And if you look over the last 10 years, there's a lot of programs that have come on in AVR and in flight standards specifically that have been directed toward actually reducing the number of lives that are lost in aviation accidents. The training programs, the air carrier training programs to get the pilots to talk to each other, to get the pilots to have better communication in the cockpit. Those are very important. We are already seeing benefits of those. Technology, of course, has moved in massive amounts into aviation, clear down to general aviation. So there's been a lot of improvements, but I think I measure the success of what we do by what happens to the accident rate.
McSweeney says that although the accident rate has been going down, the increasing popularity of jet travel is putting greater demands on the FAA to root out all the causes for airplane mishaps and eliminate as many as humanly possible.
We still have to make a great big improvement because, especially in air carrier operations, they're moving up so fast that if we don't reduce the accident rate over the next 10 years very dramatically, and we say fivefold reduction, that the accident rate or the number of accidents per whatever time frame you want to have are actually going to rise. And we believe that that's just an unacceptable thing.
The result is an ambitious new program called Safer Skies, which will require a lot of assistance from flight standards. McSweeney explains that the Safer Skies agenda is a whole new way of thinking about safety.
How do we actually get to a fivefold reduction? It's a question that I asked about a year and a half ago. I said, well, we've been talking about this fivefold reduction, but where's our line in the sand? Where's our mark on the bark where we say, this is what we're going to do, and we know that it's going to give us a fivefold reduction? And the Safer Skies agenda is the way of doing that. It's a whole new way of thinking about safety. And the key here is to take the data and find out where we should focus our resources to have the biggest bang for the buck. What we historically have done in the FAA is be driven by a lot of different influences. People want this, and another constituency wants something else. And that leads us to doing a lot of things, but is the payoff of those things worth the resources we spend on them, or could we actually